Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to part two of three of what makes a successful regulatory submission in the EU and in the US with our regulatory and clinical heavyweights, ex-head of clinical compliance at BSI, Amie Smirthwaite, and ex-FDA lead reviewer, Ryan Randall. Thank you both once again for joining, and let's get into it. Now, given your previous roles, what are some of the key challenges when it comes to manufacturers demonstrating safety and performance, or efficacy in FDA parlance, or effectiveness for those who don't like the term efficacy, for their medical device? What are some of the key challenges that you have seen as reviewers?
Yeah, I think at the FDA, I know one challenge we've seen, especially with high risk devices, it is, to get to the point of demonstrating safety and effectiveness, you have to, have your clinical study. But to get to that point, it can be really challenging because you almost have to have all of your preclinical testing completed before that point. So it can be a big challenge to do things in parallel. Like there's a lot of work that has to be done to even get to the point of an IDE approval. And then from there, you have to conduct your clinical study, and there's a long follow-up time for that. So I think in that sense, when you get to the PMA submission or your marketing application where you're laying out the case for your safety and effectiveness, a lot of the work is already done before you got to the IDE. So I think really dealing with that lead time and handling any changes to the device, especially the device design, it's always evolving. And I think being able to piece that together and explain why it's still applicable to the final device you want to market, I think that can be a big challenge.
There's a sort of different sort of dynamics happening in the EU. I often hear from manufacturers, oh, it's so easy with the US, not in that it's easy to get the clinical evidence, but they go to the FDA and the FDA says, all right, this is what we want. And so they know, right, if we do that study, we gather that clinical evidence, then we're going to get the approval. Because the notified bodies have this prescription against consulting, and they can't do anything that even remotely looks like consulting, it can be very difficult to understand actually what is going to get you through. And under MDD, we used to do things like clinical strategy reviews, and we could look at what their proposal was and give an opinion as to whether we thought that would be satisfactory. But you can't do anything like that at all now. So the problem the manufacturer has is knowing how big a study do I need to do, because there's that kind of thing. They don't want to spend millions and years following a particular route, and then they take it to the notified body and they say, sorry, it's not good enough. So I think that's a big issue. And I have heard quite a lot of manufacturers say, couldn't they have something like that in the EU? Somebody suggested expert panels, but I don't think they've got the capacity where they say, yeah, if you gather this kind of evidence, that will be sufficient. And I think, one of the other things is this kind of the granularity of data that's required. And I think probably notified bodies have become very, very risk averse. They don't want to take the risk of saying, okay, I think you've made that benefit. They just want to see the black and white evidence that this meets the requirement. So it's harder to get that kind of over the line using that benefit risk justification. It's much more kind of based on what does the hard evidence look like, even when there's really good reasons why you haven't got that top quality data.
Right. And I think you preempted my next question.
Oh, sorry.
No. It's a very logical progression. And what I was wondering is, and it's a question for both of you, Amie and Ryan, why are these items a challenge to manufacturers? Is it the lack of clear guidance on the expectations? Or may I say, is it manufacturers simply trying to cut corners? Because we know a lot of that did happen in MDD times. Excuse the plain speak, but that's the reality. What are some of the factors that may be relevant in demonstrating clinical significance of data, if the numbers are small in terms of quantity of clinical data? Are there any examples that you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, I think a lot of these I did preempt your question. I touched on some of those issues.
That's okay.
But I think, it's interesting because what I'm hearing from manufacturers now, and maybe it's because the EU kind of for lack of a better term, upped its game compared to the FDA, because it always used to be like, oh, the FDA, it's so difficult getting things through. We'll go to Europe. It's so much easier to get your device on the market. And now the requirements are much more similar between the two regulatory geographies. So what I'm hearing from manufacturers is it's not so much the cost of the studies. It's, as I said, that kind of clarity of expectations. But I heard a very interesting, I've been hearing sort of an interesting perspective recently, which is it's not even the lack of regulatory guidance or clarity, because there's also the kind of reimbursement landscape in the EU, which is very complicated compared to the US. And so what I've been hearing from some manufacturers is back when it was relatively easy to get your device on the market in the EU, they were willing to cope with that because at least you had your approval, and that meant you could sell anywhere within the EU, and then they could tackle those reimbursement issues separately and choose their strategy of which ones they were going to approach first. Now that it's just as hard or perhaps even harder to get something on the market in the EU compared to the US, so like, you know what, that combined with the complexity of reimbursement, we're just going to start with the US. But I've not heard them say it's the cost of the studies, it's this complexity and lack of clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as far as, complexity from the US perspective, I think it can be really difficult along the way because the FDA review team and the manufacturer are always learning new things as time goes on, whether it's maybe state of art is updating or new research is coming out and people are learning more about whatever disease population the device is intended to treat. But I think, as the manufacturer is performing some of their non-clinical testing or any other preclinical or feasibility studies that they may have, they're learning more about the device and how to best use it, maybe how physicians prefer to treat the patients, things like that. And so I think when things are evolving over time, it's really difficult because, for your clinical study, you have to have everything prospectively planned, and you need your analyses ahead of time. So it can be really difficult. And one thing I've seen is a manufacturer may have a study planned, but then if their FDA review team evolves over time, maybe expectations may change. So I think really for a company that wants to do a clinical study in the US or and eventually market their device there, it's really critical to have pre-submission meetings with the FDA and really make sure everyone gets a full understanding of the device and your target patient population and how you will reach the point of demonstrating safety and effectiveness. And that can really help smooth some of these speed bumps that will come up.
Makes a lot of sense. Amie and Ryan, thank you for sharing your thoughts on the challenges faced by manufacturers, at least as far as getting clinical data is concerned, and some of the peripheral considerations around it, as well as the reasons for the same. That concludes part 2. I'd invite you all to join us in part 3, where we will further this conversation. Thank you, Amie and Ryan.
Thank you.